Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Omar Kholeif, and I'm the curator
Bonjour.
of 15 Forum at 15 Forum at 154 Art Fair, London, this year, entitled Continental Drift. For those of you joining, this talk is going to be held in both English and French, and there are instructions in the chat box as to how to make this simple feature of live and simultaneous translation work for you. Just to begin, as we are approaching the end of this year's forum in London, I wanted to take the opportunity to reflect on the concept of the continental drift. The theme for this year's forum very much emerged from thinking about a world that was unfolding in different temporalities in different parts of the world. Of course, we have the choreography that has been engendered and enabled by a world within a pandemic, but there is also something much more personal, embodied, that has to do with how artists work across different geographic planes and in different modalities. I conceived the forum as thinking about this interstitial moment in history and composed it really as what I've called a symphonic reverie, where we move from antiquity to the future and back again, where we have sat together and listened to ballads and pop songs, newly composed music and poetry, debated concepts of the voice and voicelessness, trauma and memory, which collectively speaks to a world in flux, a continent in flux, but also a space of endless endlessness, one of possibility, that if you haven't been able to experience, will luckily be available for you all to listen to and to watch after this week's events. This specific panel is entitled The Walk Towards the Future, and it emerged very particularly from thinking about the role that artists play in building artistic ecologies through their own individual practices, but also through the act of institution building, by being teachers, advocates, networkers. So I wanted to bring together three very distinct voices from across the African continent and its diaspora to think through these questions in a salon-style discussion. This event today is held and presented in partnership with Phaidon on the eve and celebration of their new publication, African Artists, of which you may be able to make out a slight image of here, the beautiful color schemes of the cover here, of which all three of today's artists feature in this piece, in this publication. And as you'll find in the chat box, those listening today and attending the 154 fair are able to claim a 20% discount, and the information is in the chat box. So I'm going to introduce the three speakers today. So Michael Armitage is an artist who was born in 1984 in Nairobi, Kenya, and lives and works between Nairobi and London. And I met Michael in 2015, I believe, when I was preparing for an exhibition entitled Imitation of Life. And I was particularly struck by Michael's use of the Lebogo bark as a canvas, a material that he used to animate or reanimate the very concept of history painting, infusing it with very specific daily occurrences and events, but also with potential imaginaries of an alternate or possible future. Since then, I was fortunate to present his work in an exhibit, in that very exhibition. But also Michael has gone on to have numerous monographic exhibitions from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and most recently an exhibition at the Haus der Kunst, a monographic show that traveled to the Royal Academy of Arts, which was a collaboration with the Nairobi Contemporary Art Institute, which is one of the subjects of our conversation today, which is an organization that Michael has been working on developing with its director. Otobong Nkanga is an artist whom I met in 2014 around the constellation that is In Pursuit of Bling. An artist and poet, she animated my mind with the potential for lyric to encourage us to think about the constant mining and fragility of the earth, not only on the African continent, but in a more global sense, and to think about the notion of accountability and what that means on an individual level, but also on a macro societal level. The subject of many monographic presentations, Otobong is currently in Bregenz, where she is installing an exhibition that will open on the 2nd of November, a major monographic show, and also simultaneously has exhibitions on at the Castello de Rivoli in Torino, and also an exhibition just about to close at the Villa Arson in Nice. Otobong and I actually came to this topic through thinking about the Carve to Flow Foundation, which will be one of our subjects today, which emerged from an artwork thought process that was presented in the last Documenta in Athens and Kassel. Bill Kouélany is an artist who was born in Brazzaville, Republic of Congo. And I came to know of Bill's work through these incredible canvases that were dissected and stitched back together, which represented scenes of bodies in flux, bodies that may have been traumatized, bodies that were surviving or fighting or negotiating their space in an era of tumult and great conflict. But it was actually Otobong Nkanga who informed me of Bill's ongoing commitment to writing, the interrelationship between the literary and the visual, but also the personal and the political, and was the one also to introduce me to Bill's work as the artistic director of a contemporary art organization that Bill founded in 2012 that is devoted to supporting emerging contemporary artists. And this is the subject of discussion today as well. I have encouraged our speakers to also think of this as a space for us to convene and constellate our ideas, but also to ask each other questions about the different ways in which we work, the ways in which we negotiate our practice, and what we might deem our contribution to our local communities through educational initiatives and the creation of institutions for contemporary visual culture. And so I wanted to begin with you, Bill, with this question that I want to ask all three of you, which is to try and understand, where did the urgency come from for you to want to develop a contemporary art center in your own country that would give back and support, nurture young contemporary artists?
que je commence. Voilà, comme vous voyez
I'll
présent.
start, shall I? So, as you know, I'm Bill Kouélany. In 2012, I began the SAMI at workshops. The idea was to support and young creation. It's important to say that at some point we were we saw a lot of creation by the very classic creation. So I'm bringing the contemporary side through my practice. So I've started to become quite active, and young people are now starting to wonder about how they can express themselves. So they come and they want to learn about contemporary art and also learn about other practices. And I find that, so that's why I thought about creating a space where everyone can meet, and that's how I share my experience, and that began in 2012.
Et c'est exactement parce que t'as pas donné une...
Ah, le lieu, voilà.
Is that because you needed the place? Yes, in Brazzaville, in the historical district of Macumba, which is a very well-known part of the town.
I'll follow up with further questions in a second, but maybe I could pass that same question to Michael. What was the urgency or what was the context that led you to become involved in co-founding and co-developing the Nairobi Contemporary Art Institute?
Hi, Omar. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation as well. Nkai began, well, it was something that for me, there had been not-for-profit spaces that had shown work in various guises and took various forms throughout the last sort of 50 years at home. But in 2017, myself and Mukami Korea set up something called The Gathering. And in kind of reaching the point at which The Gathering happened, I asked a lot of the artists and students and so on in Nairobi, what is the thing that we need the most within the art scene? What are we lacking? And pretty much everybody said two things. One was a not-for-profit space, and second was a different sort of higher education than what we had at home. So that's basically what began the process that's now led to the formation of Nkai, was to provide a space that people could do ambitious shows in, but also an educative space. The other aspect of Nkai that for me made it feel urgent was that when talking to a lot of the students at that time, pretty much none of them knew any of the artists that showed sort of before 2005. So in effect, our entire contemporary visual art history was being lost to them as students. And being lucky enough to be in places and to have studied where there were museums that were accessible, also to have grown up and to be introduced to the life of an artist, to be introduced to art through artists that were shown and perhaps were no longer part of the commercial art gallery scene, but still making work and had laid the groundwork for the rest of us as artists to follow in and to have careers in. Their work was also not visible. The younger generations, for me, was really problematic. And so this was then maybe the other element of Nkai for us, which to me is important, is that we do historical shows as well and provide a space for the older generation artists that have very limited visibility at the moment to do retrospective shows or new shows and work with them. So it's kind of has those three elements to it, really.
I think there's some good follow-ups as well there. We'll come back to that. Otobong, would you like to talk to us about the Carves for Flow Foundation, which is slightly different in that its activities are alive, but the entire structure is still in formation. Oh, you're muted, Otobong.
Thanks for the invitation to be part of this group, which I'm super excited to be part of. Yeah, I think the way of thinking about Carve to Flow really came out from really thinking about ways in which a work can be shifting in its state from oil, to the soil, to soap, to economy, from economy to non-tangible knowledges, and to think of a project that is constantly shifting its state over time. And at this point in time, I mean, Carve to Flow is an art space in Athens, and which is directed by Maya Tunta, the curator, the young curator I worked with during the time of preparing the work in Documenta. And then there's also the foundation in Nigeria. And I think there's something about being in the diaspora and also trying to do a project within the continent, and you feel that you're split between two places. And you also, for me, I also feel that it needs time for one to really understand how to really get into a place and how to work with a place, how to work with that soil. And so in Nigeria, at this point in time, we're really mainly farming and really looking at crops and plants and understanding the kind of ecosystem, the kind of economy, and the way food is distributed from one end to another. And from planting, we're beginning to understand that the kind of food crisis can be quite explosive or can be immediate due to different kinds of factors of bad roads. And, there are just so many things that we're looking at. So within that, there's a part of farming and also ways of contributing within the local sphere. And the foundation is based in my village, in my hometown, in Uyo, and in Akwa Ibom State in Nigeria. But we're also looking at how the plants, through soil, through all these elements, will be able to create something with young women, and later on, in between, see how art can enter into that. Because I feel like a lot of times within the society, the idea of art has stayed in a place of painting and sculpture and very classic kind of ways of making. But I feel that the way of introducing art could be very much linked and very much directed with elements that are in place, and also to understand those elements, and from there to build something from the soil itself. Yeah. So I mean, that's the way I'm thinking, but it's something, or with the people I'm working with, it's something that I'm thinking that will take time, and it's a long-term project.
I mean, I suppose you mentioned this idea of thinking long-term, and that's something that I really want to go back to Bill to discuss, which is this idea of what does it mean to run a space over a period of time. How has it been for you establishing this atelier in Brazzaville since 2012? Have you received support? Have you received pushback? Do you deem it a success? And how do you maintain the challenges of maintaining an infrastructure while also maintaining your artistic practice?
Bon, Déjà, je voulais souligner que
I wanted to emphasize that creating these kind of spaces is very much linked to the role of the individual who is transmitting something. So people that I train as well are very much involved in this transmission process. Our art center is in a popular neighborhood. So the idea is to really encourage people from that neighborhood to come and to actually practice with us, to actually put on shows. And so the idea is to really encourage this young generation, particularly, to train as they go along. As part of my artistic practice, that the pluridisciplinary nature of what I do is really important as well. So I want to communicate with painters. The painters need to communicate with the stage artists and those that are involved more in the plastic arts. So the idea is to really have a dialogue between these different artistic practices, and it's all about this transmission. So for me, this really is what I want to do with my art space. I want it to be almost an artwork, an œuvre d'art in itself. You know, this is something that I want to have as a part of my artistic process. And when I actually set up shows, exhibitions on the site, I want to encourage even children that are actually on the street, you know, street children, to come in to find their way through art. It really is a way of actually reaching out and continuing my own practice, I feel. And so we organize these workshops, and with regard to support itself, I don't have any grants as such. There's no real day-to-day budgetary support, but we do respond to calls for projects so that we can actually have support from certain foundations like Almada in Spain. We've had some donations like this or some support like this in Brazzaville as well. There are certain structures that have assisted us. So it's a little bit precarious. It's a little bit sort of day to day, seeing how things evolve, but that's how we've worked.
There's a nice connection also to what Michael's saying, and that Michael's talking about, you know, that this, you know, the Nairobi Contemporary Art Institute was also a space that they realized needed to show older artists and established artists who don't have a space to exhibit in the contemporary work that they're making in the current ecosystem. And in a way, it's about, it seems that there is also a connection here, and that it's about creating a context for people to start to understand visual culture. And I'm curious if over time, in working in this site, that have you developed specific allies or artists who then come through the workshops and become people who run workshops, and how that's affected or changed your relationship with the local community and art scene?
Bon, en fait, les artistes, effectivement,
Yes, the artists who come to our centre and learn really are often inspired by the place and want to do something themselves. This relationship with the community is really interesting, I think, because it's not just artists, it's also just individuals who come in. They might just hear some music being played or something, and they'll come and actually just explore and see a show. It's the idea is to really be open to people just passing by in this popular neighborhood. This is something really important for me. So it's maybe somebody who hasn't said, right, I'm going to go and I'm going to go to see a show in an artistic space and I'm going to dress up. And no, that's not really the idea. The idea is to really bring people in and encourage them to become curious and to expand their points of view. They may not be connoisseurs at all. They may not really be aware of the artistic realm, but the idea is to really try to encourage that.
I wanted to go to Michael and hear more about Nkai in relation, as I was kind of, Bill made me think about the context of the space and the notion of creating a feeling. And I wondered, is there a sensibility through language, through space, through the choice of presentations that you've been considering in relation to how you bring in audiences and different people into Nkai? You're on mute, Michael. Maybe everyone should just...
Thank you. Yeah, I think, like, firstly, I mean, it's so inspirational to hear Bill talk about her space and, you know, and how they've been able to engage the community around her and how open that is. And there's just one thing where you had mentioned about these spaces allowing an understanding of contemporary art, where I don't actually feel that's correct. I think it's just more about a sort of engagement. I don't know if there's necessarily anything specific to learn in that sense in which you could understand more. And you know, I think with us, even if you just take the name, you know, Nairobi Contemporary Arts Institute, that was in itself perhaps already a direction in that. For me, part of it was giving something to resist, you know, for artists, like to resist what would be an institution, what we may do, what they may find in there, but also to feel like there is something that they're part of with a history to it, with, you know, an idea of learning, even though I'm just contradicting myself as always. But you know, that it had those kind of different voices, and in many ways I'm by far the least experienced and capable of answering this, as where we really are in our embryonic phase right now. But one of the things that's been interesting trying to operate within the pandemic has been, for us, the question, if we don't have a physical space, which we weren't able to open last year as we had intended, although we are opening this year in December, what are we? You know, like what is our audience? Who is our audience? And like that, we ended up with a couple different takes on that. One, like we're doing now, it led us to doing more online things, to developing our films that we're making on artists. You know, we're making a series of 18 films, of which we've done 5 so far. It meant that, you know, like online talks like this were important, an online version of the gathering, things like that. But for me, the limit of those at the moment is it's very much for an already existing art-going community. And I think what will become important, starting with children and then running the whole way through, is to make sure that what we do reflects the innate generosity, which is making art, and the attempt to communicate with others, you know. And I feel like that's maybe in that sense, I would say my approach is a little bit different to what Bill said, where I feel that my practice is separate. It's separate from this endeavor. Yeah, you're getting the little crosswires.
You know, the English translation is coming up French, so I don't know if there's something wrong with the toggles.
But only in so much as I would feel that my personal practice is quite individual, and one of the things that's been such a joy about doing something that involves other people is to have that, you know, and to be thinking that way the whole time, you know, in the process of making, bouncing ideas together, and like that, it's such a communal, you know, it's endeavor.
I wanted to respond first to the notion of learning and say that art's fundamental qualities, wherever they may exist, whether it's online or in physical space. I mean, my belief, as many's, you know, in a Benjaminian sense, is that engagement with the art object leads to something phenomenological and visceral, but over time that can become an experience of learning. And if children come, there is no expectation that they will decode and understand a painting, neither that artists will learn about entire new movements or curators or anything. But learning is, interestingly, I feel, a kind of secondary proxy that comes out of this. But that's what's fascinating to me, is that unlike, for example, traditional not-for-profit NGO structures, those tend to have to be under an educational remit to receive specific funds. And that's actually a very interesting point for you to mention, that that's not in the mission statement necessarily, for example. But there's something, you mentioned that the space didn't open as expected, and you did something, and I was curious about the relationship of that to Nkai and the influence of it on your practice, which was your exhibition, your touring exhibition from House de Kunst to the Royal Academy, featured the work of numerous artists from both Kenya and from the African continent who has inspired you, who featured in the exhibition. And I would love to know whether that was completely independent from that context, or whether there was an interrelationship, because it sounds very much that that's the kind of thing that you would seek. Those kinds of visual conversations are ones that you would be seeking to make with Nkai.
Yeah, so again, I suppose this was one of the opportunities that came up as a result of the pandemic, where I had a show at the Haus der Kunst in Munich, and there was the potential to take on a larger space. And in the conversations with Andrea Soni and Anna Schneider, this idea that it could take on other aspects of things that I'm involved in, like with Nkai, and have some element of other artists' work be part of it, came open. So then to me, the question became, like, what is a meaningful way of doing this, you know? And one of the points where, not from, I would say it wasn't from my wanting it to have that, but from the institution wanted it to have some relationship to my work. So, which, well, yeah, fair enough. But as a result, I wanted it to look at the evolution of figurative painting in East Africa, running from the 50s to 2000, you know, a period where very little agency is given and respect is given to the ideas and the considerations of the artists at those times, and both in terms of writing and showing. So it was an attempt to look back, again, in a relatively limited format, through the eyes of 6 artists, at the evolution and ideas of figurative painting. So, and that itself will be a show that will come to Nkai. This also provided us an opportunity to start conversations with institutions that have pretty extraordinary collections of East African artists outside of the continent. One being the World Culture Museum in Frankfurt, who rather extraordinarily have 130 paintings by Jack Katarikawe, who's one of our leading artists from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. It's the sort of thing where if we wanted to do a retrospective show, you couldn't do one without that collection, and you can't find that sort of work in Nairobi. So it also meant that we could begin having these conversations with other institutions, and that was kind of where it really provided an opportunity for Nkai to start the collaborations, which, to my mind, are what will allow us to have any form of success. You know, is how much we can partner with others and how we can do this in as communal a way as possible.
Thank you, Michael. Otobong, can you unmute yourself, please? Because I'm going to ask you a question. It's best to begin that way, isn't it, now? For our audience's, lovely audience's sake. Otobong, the Carve to Flow Foundation is germinating, as it were, and I'm specifically thinking of the foundation in Nigeria. And I understand from our conversations that it's an incredibly complex project in terms of the various prongs that you want to enable, but also in terms of funding, supporting, and generating those. And I feel we need to know more so that we can all help in some way, engage. Can you tell us?
Well, I think there are different ways in which I'm thinking about, or we're thinking about the project and the foundation. But I think I forgot to mention that there are different aspects within Carve to Flow, which is here within Europe, how we move through different spaces to be able to think around soil or to think around economy. And Carve to Flow has been in Grupos Bau, and we worked with Nuno Vasconcelos, who's a Portuguese architect, to be able to really talk about the soil from Berlin. And we're now coming into Antwerp to really reflect within the art school, the Royal Art School in Antwerp, as a way of expanding academy, and as a way of thinking beyond the classic kinds of propositions that the school does, but in a way to move through the city, to understand the city from its underbelly. So Carve to Flow works very much in this very space of knowledge-based works, but also terrain work and understanding locality. And at the same time in Nigeria, I think one of the things I think is important to mention is that we really got land to be able to work on. And I hadn't been to my father's land or my father's village since he died in 1981. So the first time I went back was in 2018 to the village. Normally I'd go back to Nigeria, to Lagos, to Abuja, to different places. But this was the first time I had to confront, let's say, the past, and to be in a place that I never really wanted to go back to. But it was the first time I entered in a place and I felt I connected to it deeply without understanding why. And so I think the notion of actually getting a piece of land to be able to start working with people was the first kind of approach of thinking how to connect. And so at this point in time, we're really thinking, how can we work with young women and connect it to the farm? So that means not necessarily them working on the land, but a way that we can break the kinds of cost of things in which they can then have certain parts of the fruits of the labor that happens within there, in which they can then start building an economy for themselves. So for me, I'm very much interested in economy, and I'm very much interested in how how land, how plants, how different elements that are so connected to the place you live in can generate an economy. But at the same time, we also understand how these economies can be broken. And so for me, it's been interesting to be able to see from, especially during this COVID time, we were meant to go back to Nigeria in 2020 and to do workshops with the women. But with the COVID, it was very difficult. So we decided that it would be better to start planting. And by planting, that means that you have to look at the time frame of the plant. So by the time you can plant, let's say plantain, that takes 9 months. So during the time of COVID, you're already starting to grow things. Or if you're looking at herbal plants, you're already starting to grow those things that you will need to be able to start making workshops, to be able to start working with students, let's say in the university from the agricultural sector, or to be able to work with people that are botanists. So it was a way to just start by planting itself. And from there, we're now discussing on what kinds of areas would be interesting to start developing. And that development will also be infused with art. So my own approach is not to bring art or not to work as bringing art in the first place, but to work from materials, to work from the local kind of fauna and flora, and from that to be able to develop ways of thinking about making, and not only art, but also craft. So the two totally mingled and intertwined. So I think that's where we are at. I mean, the Carve to Flow part in Athens is working slowly and surely.
In Athens, so that's the production center of the soap?
Yes, yeah.
So just to clarify for everybody, so it began with your research around the body and thinking about these materials, these scents from around the Mediterranean, from around these contested spaces, and Athens became the production center, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think maybe I could clarify for people in the sense that the whole project of Carve to Flow was really thinking about how do you create from places of crisis, and how can you rethink the ways of ideas of exploitation, and what does that mean? And so for me, Athens, when I was invited to do Documenta in Castle and in Athens, it made sense to be able to make a soap that would use the olive oil. Let's say 60% of the soap was olive oil from Kalamata, and the rest were oils coming from North Africa, West Africa, and also from the Mediterranean, because these are the places at this point in time, or even for quite some time, that is under tension, under war situation, ecological, economical crises. And by making a soap, the Blackstone 08, the soap was a way to be able to think about ways in which economies flow from oils to become a solid state, and from a solid state, when being sold, becomes money, which is another tangible form. But once you shift that tangible form into something that is not tangible, we then how do you say, we have to think of ways in which that non-tangible form starts affecting people's lives. So that transformation was important for me to be able to important for all of us that were in the project, to be able to come back to Athens, the place that we've taken out so much oil, so much material, even the knowledge of making the soap, and to be able to put something in a way that balances or tries to balance out what we've extracted from a place. So for me, I'm always constantly thinking of that notion of extraction, which is not just a material extraction, but the knowledge extraction. There are many kinds of extraction. And how do you balance out? How do you find a way that one thing that you've taken out of here can fulfill maybe another thing that you might not see the result now, but you might see the result in 10 years. And I'm interested in that kind of a timeline, and different things that punctuate that timeline.
And just to kind of clarify something as well, which is for me very interesting. This is kind of, would it be fair to say this is kind of like a Gesamtkunstwerk, a mega work, in that an ultimate work, in that you're bringing your interest in extraction of knowledge production, archival systems of knowledge, the earth, minerals, into a circular transcontinental structure where one feeds the other. So the soaps create an economy that begins to generate the basis for the foundation in Nigeria that will self-sustain through skill sharing. And those are pretty, I mean, is it fair to say this is a kind of mega artwork that you see being at the core of everything you do from now on? Or is it something that you see as you will hand it off?
I think I do not know, because the way of conceiving Carve to Flow was for it to be able to evolve and flow. So even in Athens, I'm in constant dialogue with Maya, but she takes a big control of the art space and what it's meant to be, and how it should be. In Nigeria, I would like that it becomes really part of the people's how do you say, the people's land, or the people's way of like evolving in the ways that they do things. So I do not know how things will evolve, but what we are thinking of is really to think of ways in which we can find within this project ways of generating economy and generating knowledge of soil, knowledge of farming, and from that knowledge, how to make things. We are specialists of raffia, of palm oil, of the different things that we know how to make. But at the same time, when I went back, I realized that a lot of this, like making raffia, has become a knowledge that is totally slowly disappearing. And there are much more things made out of plastic or things that are imported into Akwa Ibom region. So it's like, we have this knowledge, it's ingrained in us, we have the material. How are we going to develop that? And that can even enter into an artistic practice, but to start from the core itself. So I do not know how things will evolve, but I think it's by the encounters that I'm having through meetings with, even to build the foundation, to people that have knowledge of making products, to people that have knowledge of the soil, we're dealing with so many people that are involved, making the project evolve. But if I have to say, for example, with my artistic projects, I realized that a lot of the decisions I'm making in relation to ways in which I'm making work is actually to reflect how is the work going to affect the soil? How am I going to make a work that is constantly reflecting on how it is put back in the earth, even in the process of making? For example, here in Bregenz, I was very much interested in working with Martin Rauch, and Martin Rauch is, how do you call it? He's a ceramist from start, but he's one of the specialists of making rammed earth. So my work, I've been working here with him for the past 1 week, and that knowledge I'm having is I'm thinking in long term in relation to Nigeria, and trying to connect with people that understand specific ways of working with material, in which if I need to build something, that I will have the knowledge of understanding how to compress, how to work with that in a specific locality. So the way of making work is intertwined with the kinds of collaborations I want to have, but those collaborations must feed Nigeria or the project in the future.
I want to ask a maybe difficult question for everybody. So if you could unmute yourself all, and also to welcome the audience to, if you have any questions, to please drop them in the chat box, and for the team to make sure that I get them. This question is really about the relationship between market and capital. And I wondered if any of you have made decisions about, for example, where you will exhibit, what you will be willing to sell, who you'd be willing to take money from, on the basis of that these, for example, your commercial galleries or your donors or collectors, that they support these projects. And I do know in some cases, I have heard of, for example, galleries supporting artists to build schools, to contribute to community projects, but it tends to be very rare. So I was curious if any of that, if there was a merging of those aspects in any of your practices for any of you.
I'm happy to go with that. Yeah. You know, again, I suppose I've been lucky to work with a gallery that's been very good and generous to me like that. But that had been one of the aspects of working together where, for me, it is important that those endeavors are supported by the commercial side of my own practice. But I have to admit, beyond that, though, like I feel like part of the success of Nkai will be when it isn't reliant on a relationship to myself. If it evolved into being something that others felt was necessary to keep alive, and you know, and for those in Nairobi feel like it's worth having, and there are other ways of sustaining it, which are less precarious than on an individual. I think I would like, for me, that would be one significant element of success, that it's important enough for the community to want to keep.
Bill, Otobong?
Yeah, I think I would say that that has been one of the main questions I asked when developing the project Have to Flow, because most times we ask foundations or ask institutions for money and things like that, and it leaves a lot of things precarious, and also that you see a lot of things die. A lot of great ideas, a lot of great projects have disappeared because of that question of money, and we always ask that question of money. So the idea of this transformative, that a work of art can take different forms, can enter into the enterprise, can enter into a world of different worlds, was for me very important. So even in Nigeria, with the people I'm working with, we're constantly thinking, how are we going to sustain this? Because we had a certain amount of capital from the selling of the soap. And so with that, we're really calculating on how one can reach not only earning money from, let's say, the farm itself, but also expanding a way that other people can earn money through the farm. And so if you can start by giving out a certain amount of fruits or vegetables, and this person can sell it, then the person can sell it at a higher, we can sell it at a much cheaper rate, because some of what we looked at was also to see that the things we're planting are the things that you normally get from the north of Nigeria, but we're planting it in the south. So that means we're cutting costs on transport, on all the little things that will make it so expensive, that you can then now sell to local people at a much cheaper rate than what is in the market. And they can then sell that at a much higher rate, at the normal rate. So they can earn money underneath that. And so we're looking at all these different kinds of models in which to sustain the project, but within that money can also, what we earn can also go into artistic, educational, other kinds of realm. But we are so grounded within that community. But within this part of the world, so far we've been lucky that the money that we got from the soaps has been able to sustain both projects. But of course, we're also looking at different ways. I'm discussing with my galleries in which some works can be donated in a way, so the galleries do not take the percentages, but 100% goes to the foundation. But also looking with institutions that, one can always acquire a certain amount of soaps that can then be used within social realm, but not enter into collections. So that money can go to the foundation, but the soap does not enter into a person's personal collection or a museum's collection, but enters into social endeavors in the society. So I'm looking at different models in which it still keeps the core and the essence and the ethics that are around the work, but would still definitely generate money so that things can move on and things can develop in places that they need to.
Thank you, Otobong. Bill, did you want to comment in any way on anything that's been said in relation to this subject? Oh, you're on mute. Just
Ok, là c'est bon, voilà. Donc, je voulais dire
Okay, I think that's working now. I just wanted to say that this issue of money is something that always comes up, of course. I have many galleries that do support us, but I think what Otobong said is really inspiring as well, because it's something that you have to think about in the long term, sustainability. We have been working now for around about 10 years, and the idea is to really create something that we can transmit to future generations. So the idea of interesting the community is really important. I'm now going to try and go outside of Brazzaville and into villages to really try to reach out to new populations. So this link to the earth is also really important now. I think it's a really important source of reflection, and I'm really inspired by what Otobong is doing in this sense. I think I'd like to really try to reorientate myself a little bit, think about how we can work on this transmission to communities and really interest individuals. I think now, after our 10 years of existence, this is a new track, perhaps.
thank you, Bill. Well, I wondered if you guys had any burning questions for each other that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I think I was interested in asking Bill with regards to her space, because I remember we met in Pointe Noire and we hung out a bit in Pointe Noire in Congo. And at that point in time, you hadn't yet opened the space. But in discussion with you, you talked about how this, I mean, in relation to the location, to the way you opened up the work. I'm interested in understanding how the beginning of that happened, how it, how you developed that, and what has come out of that. I mean, are they young artists? Who are the artists? Are they young people that are now doing work? What are the developments that you've seen in relation to people and the energy you've put in them?
Oui, oui. Ben, comme effectivement, on a passé des bons moments à Pointe-Noire.
Yes, as I was saying earlier on, in fact, I think that after 10 years, I can report back on that, because next year it will be 10 years. I've inspired many artists. I have brought them out of the shadows. And today, most of the young people the young people now working internationally have a link to the Sam. They could not just Congolese, but they could also be Cameroonian, and etc. But that they could also have, they all have in common this link with the Sam Foundation. But to answer your question, I think that we are very well known outside. We're known in Paris, our artists are known in London, but most of them are not known back home. So I would like to help these young people, because they are really at the limit of where they can go in Europe. And I would like to help these artists to bring back something to their countries. But I think sometimes it's quite complicated, because they you know, that they once they get to Europe, you know, they kind of forget what's happening back home. So that's where that's where I come in. They can, you know, have an impact on their villages, on their homes. Sometimes you know, you have young artists who don't know how to defend themselves, and perhaps that they've experienced trauma. Perhaps through art, they can find a way of expressing themselves and a way to defending themselves. So I think that from November, I'm going to start bringing artists that are working with me, and I'm going to ask them to come to the villages and give them the opportunity to connect with the village. It's great to be able to take your art overseas, but it's also important to bring it back home. And perhaps we can share that with young people, with children, and maybe they'll learn that they could find interests in other areas such as culture, agriculture, farming. How can we use local products, local plants? And I think, but it's true that I think that I have had an impact on many generations of artists, but perhaps they can be a little bit selfish, and maybe they could, you know, they could share a bit more, and that's what I would like them to do, and that's what I have given them this feedback, and to not, you know, pursue their careers on an individual level, but also to remember their communities.
Any, Michael, do you want to ask anything, say anything, Otto? Bill?
Yeah, just wanted to echo, you know, what Bill was saying, and particularly about how you're setting things up, Otobong, where it's really exciting because, like, that question of if you also do receive funds, where that comes from, and wanting, for me, I'd always wanted it to be locally funded in one way or another, but I hadn't really considered the fact that there could be a sort of commercial element to that in terms of using local produce to grow the entire endeavor, and how important that initial connection is. So it's really like what I find amazing with what you're doing as well is that perhaps it's the most conceptual out of the three endeavors, but then in another sense, it's literally from the ground. So it's kind of extraordinary to see it take that form. And I don't know, I just find that such an exciting way forward, you know. And I'm so intrigued to see what that evolves into as well. And it's so exciting like that to hear, Bill, about you also how you're kind of expanding. And I wonder, seeing as you've been doing it for a little while, what has most surprised you about setting up and starting, Bill? And
Bill? Bill?
If that was lost in translation.
Pardon, j'ai pas bien compris la question. Qu'est-ce qui m'a...
What was the question? Could you repeat it? It wasn't clear.
Yeah, just from when you started, what has been the most surprising thing that you were not anticipating over the last 10 years?
En fait, bon, déjà, moi, je suis plasticienne à la base. Donc, déjà...
Well, firstly, I'm a sculptor. So when I created the center, and so the first people who joined me were sculptors. Today, it is, we have a lot of dancers in the center. They take up a lot of space. So already, that was unexpected. I expected a lot of sculptors, art critics, and you know, to really speak about contemporary art and painters. But it's now got so big. So it's not a space that I know or that I inhabit, but it is. It's also a kind of residence with all kinds of artists. There are artists who live there, who they might spend 3 months there before going back into the world. So I didn't really expect, to have this, I would like this initiative to go beyond who I am and beyond what I do. And this way, it's something that can survive in the long term. And sometimes these initiatives can be too linked to the person who created the initiatives. And sometimes these initiatives disappear when the artist moves away. So I want this to continue. I want it to survive without me. I want young people to take over and to hand it over to the next generation in the same way. So I don't yet have the formula for this, but I would like this to live independently of me and independently of my career.
I would like to just mention one thing before we go, because I remember when we were in Pointe Noire with Bill, she was also very much involved with Goodileye, remember? And so, I mean, when Goodileye died, that was so sad to see that the bakery also, I don't know if it's still going on, but I haven't heard much. So, but it's just that one gets to realize that young artists, people that are developed, I mean, Goody was such an amazing artist, and also someone that we were at the Rijks together in Amsterdam. And then when he went back, opened up the bakery, and then things just became, he died and things just became complicated. But I think it was just from observing all this, different spaces that open up, or Le Centre Soleil in Mali with Hamagoro, and you're looking at all these places, and we start with youth and energy and the little money we have, and one gets to realize how precarious these things are and how hard these things are. And when one person goes, what happens to everything? And I know that Billy was very much involved in that, but I don't know really what has come out of that. But just to finalize and to talk and to speak with Michael, it's a pity I missed the first gathering. But I'm wondering, when is the next gathering? Because we had the invitation in February last year, and the whole pandemic took over. But I was kind of excited with, following up on this. I'm just wondering, when is the next gathering?
Michael, you're muted.
It's a good question, Otobong. It's a very good question. I'm also wondering the same. But one thing we would love for you to be part of it, like in whatever form that may take. We'd absolutely love for you to be part of it. And the same to you, Billy.
Sorry.
Go.
Only for artists, can I check?
No, you're welcome to, Omar.
I feel very excluded all of a sudden.
You're always welcome. It's an open door.
Yeah. We have to wrap up now, but I just wanted to. Oh, Bill, sorry, what were you going to say?
Non, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec les autres.
I completely agree with everyone else. Omar, you are most welcome, and it's a gathering between us. It'll be fantastic to make connections. It always leaves me very inspired. It gives me a lot of energy. And it's true that it's so precarious at the moment, and it's very easy to lose motivation. And I thought about Goodileye, who created this space in the Cameroon. And of course, when he left us, everything disappeared. So that's why I think it's so important that we continue in his legacy, and it's not always easy, because it's not an easy area to work in.
Thank you so much for paying the honor as well. I brought the three of you together because post-pandemic, the nature and feeling and future of institutions has felt as if it's collapsing. When I talk about institutions, I'm not simply discussing museums, but equally government support structures that are seemingly invincible, to currency, to even very basic tenets in education. And what I believe is that the society in which we're moving into, if we think about nature, if we think about the earth and its fragility, something that we've talked about a lot over the last few days. We need to create symbiotic structures. And what you're all doing is creating spaces of symbiosis that are not simply reliant on you, but you are progenitors of trying to create something that will turn a tide, a perception. And for that, I congratulate you and commend you, but also implore you to continue and also to push harder. And I believe that includes, for example, pushing auction houses, commercial galleries, whatever it is that you're doing, art fairs, to, like Otobong was suggesting, certain works are donations for the foundation. Certain collectors are purchasing works for your organizations. And that needs to become something that's much more commonly understood as part and parcel of representing an artist, is that you represent the full spectrum of their activities, which is not something that everybody does, and something that I'm quite intimately aware of. Likewise, even with the not-for-profit sector, how can the spaces of the Tate galleries be used to support or give voice to your platforms? And so I hope that we can continue these conversations offline, wherever it may be, but we can also expand the group as well, because there are many, many individuals who I've been talking to, artists from across the continent and in other spaces into South Asia and Southeast Asia, who would like to think of, dream of the same. But thank you for your courage and your bold endeavors. Otobong Nkanga, Michael Armitage, and Bill Kouélany for being with us this afternoon. And again, just to say thank you to Phaidon for supporting this event, and which was held in to see this fantastic artistic endeavor that I just did there. And if you'd like the book, anyone here can go online to Phaidon's website and put Phaidon 20 for a 20% discount. But again, thank you so much. And to the audience for listening. And I hope that we will think of this as an act, the beginning of a kind of solidarity, not a solidarity of struggle or fight, but a solidarity around imagination and possibility. Thank you so much.